As if there is not enough going on in Ukraine, Lithuania is preparing to go into a full-on war with Russia. And as usual, it's all Putin's fault. This is Kaliningrad, a small Russian administrative division in the Baltics that Putin has been using to try and wiggle its way into Lithuania and the Baltic states. The Russian president has a way of messing with everything he touches, and now his aggressive push into Ukraine is going to ruin the mutual understanding that Lithuania and Kaliningrad had established. In fact, the relationship between these two areas has suffered so much that Lithuania's defense minister, Liudas Kasčiūnas, has stated that $648 million will be set aside for mass defense fortifications in light of this impending war. What makes this war different from any other regional conflict, and what Putin may have failed to account for, is the fact that, unlike Ukraine, Lithuania is a member of NATO, which means that this little war in Kaliningrad could drag the US and the rest of NATO's heavy hitters right to Putin's doorstep. We have been reporting on the Russian-Ukrainian war for some time now, and as our community, you have stood by us faithfully. Unfortunately, in recent months, we have been struggling to push our content because Putin bots and the algorithm have been downvoting our videos. You can help us by liking our videos and sharing them with your community too. Okay, let us get into today's video. As Lithuania prepares for massive offense, the Queen Louis Bridge, which stands between Lithuania and Kaliningrad, has been closed. Lithuania has begun to build fortifications to stop Kaliningrad tanks from coming over it in the next coming weeks. Landmines will be buried along the crossing to blow up anyone who dares to ignore the boundaries. The bridge, which used to be a symbol of good faith between the two territories, has now become heavily patrolled, and the Lithuania Border Guard Service has declared that the country has raised its surveillance to the maximum level. Putin will, no doubt, match that effort, since he simply cannot, under any circumstances, afford to lose Kaliningrad. If this small Russian administrative falls, then it is no exaggeration to say that Russia, as a whole, will be instantly doomed. However, before we get into that, let's go over the history of the land in detail. Most of you probably have never heard about this little region, but it is an important piece of the war puzzle. Kaliningrad is a Russian exclave, which means that it belongs to Russia, but it's not in Russia. Take a look at this map again. Kaliningrad is nestled between Poland and Lithuania, and it is 200 miles away from Russia. Its weird position makes it very important to Putin's expansionist plans because it's kind of like his octopus tentacle in the Baltic states. With a population of just over 1 million people, the oblast is not very big, and it covers an area of about 5,830 square miles, which is about 15,000 square kilometers. The region is just a fifth of Lithuania, but it is a bit of a mixed bag with a Polish, Lithuanian, and German-speaking population. You're probably wondering how Russia managed to get its hands on such a territory, and the story behind it is actually intriguing. Kaliningrad has been a part of Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed, but its past began in 1255 when the region was run by a German military order known as the Teutonic Knights. They named the little spot Königsberg, which means the King's Mountain, in honor of King Ottokar II. Its position on the Baltic Sea made it the perfect little trading spot, and in 1454 it became a part of Prussia, which was a vassal state for Poland. Reformation swept through the area, and in 1525 the Duke of Prussia secularized the territories in the area. Königsberg suffered a bit of an identity crisis during the 1600s as the Polish and Swedish fought for the land. But in 1701, Prussia sat back down in the driver's seat and made Königsberg the capital of Prussia. All these little states were sucked into one big empire known as the German Empire. The exact year for this was 1871. And from there, Königsberg began to thrive as a cultural and economic center. Otto von Bismarck was the star of the show during the period of time until the First World War came around. During that time, Königsberg became a military base, and after the First World War, it became a Nazi party base. During the Second World War, the Allied powers struck the city heavily because it was the strength of Germany at the time, and in April of 1945, the Soviet forces captured the city during the Battle of Königsberg. The Soviet Union's Red Army had been pushing into Eastern Europe and launching what it was calling the East Prussian Offensive. The battle started in January with 130,000 German troops defending the city, and it all came to an end in April of 1945 when the Soviet Union finally managed to overpower Germany and facilitate its surrender. With the new victory came a name change and an ownership shift. Königsberg became Kaliningrad in honor of a brave Soviet leader known as Mikhail Kalinin. From the ashes of Königsberg, Kaliningrad was rebuilt, and it became a Soviet naval base and industrial center. So it basically became just as great as Königsberg was, but it was now under different leadership. After the Soviet Union was dissolved, Kaliningrad did not share the same history as the other Baltic states that got the opportunity to run off and become independent. It remained a part of the Russian Federation, and in the 1990s there was some economic decline and population loss. This drop was only for a few years, and since the 2000s, Kaliningrad has been thriving as an economic center and a tourism area too. Kaliningrad has come a long way since then, and now that Russia has fortified it, the region is Putin's strategic playground. Let's talk a little about why Putin does not want to lose this land and why it is so important in his ambitions. Firstly, the oblast gives Russia access to the all-important Baltic Sea. This sea is a strategic treasure because it borders 9 countries: Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and Sweden. A lot of shipping and trading happens on this border. So it's very important for Russia that it has a slice of this pie. As the only port that is ice-free all year round, Kaliningrad is the headquarters of the Russian Baltic Fleet, with 1,000 military personnel and 100 units of special military equipment. Russia has also begun to carry out rocket and artillery drills in this location in preparation for a war with NATO. The reason that Putin has built up his military presence for strategic deterrence on the Baltic Sea is because he has become very weary of the heavy United States naval presence in the waters. It may look like a US-Russia issue, but on a wider scale, the Baltic Sea is a contentious area between NATO and Moscow because a lot of Baltic states are part of the NATO alliance. In March of 1999, Poland entered NATO, and the other Baltic states followed shortly after in 2004. To make matters worse, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland all entered the European Union, which is another alliance that Putin despises. In recent years, Putin has been feeling suffocated by all these states, and because of that, he has fought hard to fortify Kaliningrad against them. Outside of being a naval base, Kaliningrad is also a nuclear house for the Kremlin. In Putin's numerous nuclear rants, he has often announced plans to station Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad to counter the US missile shield that has been developing in Eastern Europe. Washington had to try to explain that the shield has nothing to do with Putin, as it was actually meant to counter possible missile attacks by Iran, but Putin is convinced otherwise. This has led to a fear amongst the Baltic nations that in the event that the war with Ukraine turns nuclear, they could be hit with nukes as well. We also need to consider Kaliningrad's command of the Baltic Sea is not the only reason Putin holds it in high regard. This region is also in a strong position along the Suwalki Gap, which is a little corridor that has earned the interesting nickname of NATO's soft underbelly and the most dangerous place on Earth. It is a 62.14 mile, about 100-kilometer, piece of land that is in between Kaliningrad and Belarus. On top of being a little transport line, it is also a border between the NATO countries of Poland and Lithuania. Because of this, Russia is fighting hard to take over the strip of land so that it can cut off these Baltic states from NATO. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former US Army Europe commander, recognizes the great advantage that Russia has in this regard, stating that Russia could take over the Baltic states faster than we would be able to defend them. All of these geographical pressures have existed since the late 1900s, but the tension between the two countries began to heat up in 2022 when Lithuania instituted a ban on goods subject to EU sanctions from passing through Kaliningrad. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the EU bloc began a form of economic warfare. Despite this blockade being the consequences of its actions, Russia was furious and stated that Lithuania was playing a Western puppet. Russia's anger here seems misplaced, considering the fact that everyone was imposing sanctions against Russia during the time. Lithuania responded, saying that it was merely upholding European Union sanctions. And the Lithuanian foreign minister responded to the accusation, stating, "It's not Lithuania doing anything. It's European sanctions that started working from 17th of June. It was done with consultation from the European Commission and under European Commission guidelines." This little fight worsened things between Moscow and the EU. And during a visit to Kaliningrad, Mr. Pastrusev, Putin's friend, stated that the blockade by Lithuania was instigated by the West in violation of international law. This same international law, the one that Putin ignores, is apparently supposed to protect Russia too. Russia was so hot and bothered that it called the EU ambassador to the Russian Foreign Ministry over the blockade to try and air its grievances. As a threat, the secretary of Russia's Security Council stated that appropriate measures would be taken in the near future. The near future came a little sooner than expected, when Russian hacker group Killnet claimed responsibility for a denial of service (DDoS) cyber attack on Lithuania, saying it was in response to the decision to block the transit of some sanctioned goods to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. A DDoS cyber attack is one that floods a server with traffic so that users cannot connect to the services the site offers. Lithuania's cybersecurity center stated that the attacks hit the transportation, energy, and financial sectors, and that they increased in intensity throughout the weeks. Russia was very happy to claim the attacks, and the group called Killnet released a statement boldly declaring their move. When the question came up of whether they had done it because of Lithuania's blockade, the group spokesperson said yes. Killnet demolished over 1,652 web resources and stated that they would only lift their attack if Lithuania lifted the blockade. With tensions brewing since 2022, the war in Ukraine was enough to put the plans for war into motion. The question that is on Lithuania's mind right now is, who's next? Everyone knows that Putin is not just stopping at Ukraine, and so one of the Baltic nations is definitely next on the plan. According to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, what is happening in Ukraine is a wake-up call. Putin's aggression in Ukraine is proof that there are only a few years left to prepare, and NATO needs to gear up. Tomas Janelinas, a political scientist at Vilnius University, actually sees what is happening in Ukraine as a blessing in disguise. Because of what has happened on that side, Lithuania has time to prepare for an offensive. Unfortunately for Kaliningrad, whatever goodwill existed between it and Lithuania was completely destroyed by what Putin did in February of 2022. Darius, a Lithuanian who used to live in Lithuania's Panomun, just across the bridge from Kaliningrad's Sovetsk, recalled how, in the past, he even used to have a Russian friend when he was a kid. However, after the beginning of the war, Lithuanians have not wanted anything to do with Kaliningrad. Lithuania has been gearing up for war against Kaliningrad, but its real fight is with mainland Russia. Lithuania has a very complicated history with Russia, and it fought very hard to gain its sovereignty from it. Its intense preparation is because it never wants to find itself in the same place as it was all the way back in the time of the Romans and the Vikings. During this time, there was a small tribe from the area around Vilnius known as the Lithuanians, and it was worried about a rising threat that was coming from the east. To combat the threat, Lithuania and Poland formed a commonwealth in 1569, which successfully kept Russia at bay. Unfortunately, Poland began to Polonize Lithuania, and Polish culture became superior. The duo began to lose its strength in the 17th century, and after losing a couple of wars, it was partitioned and annexed by Prussia, Austria, and Russia, falling under Russian rule. From Russia, it fell under Nazi Germany and then went back to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets reoccupied it, the level of brutality it carried out against Lithuania was extreme. During Russia's occupation of Lithuania, it introduced a program of Russification and attempted to eliminate the Lithuanian language and culture in favor of Russian culture. During this time, in the mid-19th century, thousands of people were murdered, tortured, and expelled to Siberia in cattle carriages. After spending all these years suppressed, Lithuania started gearing up to take back control in the 1940s when its guerrilla resistance began. Momentum picked up in 1988 when a group called the Sąjūdis, which was made up of 500 intellectuals and young Communist Party officials, started a movement. After much protesting, the momentous day came on the 11th of March 1990, when Lithuania became the first Soviet-controlled state to restore its independence. Though the initial hit was brutal, the Soviet Union refused to go down that easy, and it conducted 3 attack phases before it gave in. At first, Soviet troops were ordered to take youths and deserters forcibly after Lithuania refused to agree to Soviet conscription as a way of quenching the spirit of the revolution. In the second phase of the attack, the USSR troops strengthened their position on the borders and began confiscating all firearms from Lithuanians. As if that was not enough, they also took control of buildings and institutions that belonged to the Communist Party and the Economic Front. The USSR implemented a blockade of goods, including oil and gas supplies, to Lithuania for 10 weeks. Still, Lithuania stood by its decision, and eventually the USSR had to concede. As if that was not enough bad karma, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and all of the other Baltic states also got the opportunity to break away. After such a complex and traumatic history, it is undeniable that Lithuania has deep economic, psychological, and spiritual scars. The recent moves by Putin in Ukraine have triggered a fear that it had long been suppressing, and that is what has led us to today as Lithuania gears up for war. No time has been wasted, and already Lithuania's defense ministry, together with the armed forces, have already begun to install what they are calling permanent counter-mobility measures. The installation of these measures has been strategic, and the starting point has been the bridge separating Panomun from Sovetsk so that Lithuania can stop the movement of hostile vehicles. Defense Minister Kasčiūnas has stated that the Lithuanian government is looking to spend about $653 million on this project over the next decade, and plans are in place to boost its defense budget to spend nearly 3% of GDP. A large portion of the money is going to go to mines that are already on their way to Lithuania as we speak. These mines are specifically anti-tank land mines, some that are horizontal action mines and others that are bottom mines. On top of the land mines, naval mines are also being acquired to launch attacks against Russia's Baltic fleet, and to fast-track mine development and make it cheaper, the Defense Ministry is also discussing the possibility of Lithuanian companies producing them. Kasčiūnas also revealed a fortification plan that involved placing permanent border fortifications at 2 locations in September, and opening the first counter-mobility park at the end of August. A total of 27 counter-mobility parks are supposed to be constructed, and Lithuania is looking to establish them on a weekly basis. These counter-mobility parks are going to have 4 types of fortifications. The first one is going to be the Dragon's Teeth. These obstacles are large, triangular-shaped blocks that are placed in rows and patterns. What they do is block vehicle movement and delay enemy advances, giving troops time to advance and attack. These anti-tank barriers were used in the Second World War, particularly on the Eastern Front. But as the saying goes, if it's not broken, don't fix it. The next fortification are the Hedgehogs, which can be used to stop traffic and Spanish riders and common roadblocks that serve the same function. Some of these counter-mobility parks will be near the border and will serve as the initial line of defense. The Queen Louis Bridge, which is between the Kaliningrad Oblast and Lithuania, will also be lined with 80 Dragon Teeth and 7 Hedgehogs, and these will be further fortified by concertina wires. In terms of spending, on top of the $648 million, about $864 million will be allocated to the armed forces, and $2.6 million for the purchase of counter-mobility engineering equipment this year. Defense Minister Kasčiūnas explained that no stone would be left unturned, stating that not only will we create bases where to base the fortifications, but we will fortify some areas permanently and immediately at the end of the summer. For example, there is a bridge that is not in use, but an enemy could potentially drive over it, so we will fortify it. Another feature that Lithuania will be taking advantage of is the Second World War-era bunkers all over the country's border with Kaliningrad. The Red Army constructed these bunkers along the Molotov line that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Seas. There are around 300 of them in Lithuania, and although the Soviet Union did not manage to construct them in time, they were well laid out. Some of these bunkers are right in the middle of the Suwalki Gap, which is the prime strip of land we spoke about earlier that connects the Baltics with the other side. These bunkers need a little bit of sprucing up, but they could be used as fighting positions or as shelters for civilians. Lithuania is looking to refurbish these bunkers as a part of the infrastructure for its military personnel. Outside of the government, even the residents of Lithuania are calmly preparing for the war with Kaliningrad. Vistiasis, which is a small town in the southwestern of Lithuania, may seem calm, but there are preparations underway. This town is so close to Russia that its residents can see Russian border guards on the other side from their homes. And Irina Skuskis, a factory worker, told Al Jazeera, "We take a swim in the lake just 10 or so meters from the barbed wire fence. Sometimes we can hear the border guards on the Russian side playing music. When that happens, we have a barbecue and dance to the music that's coming from the tower." Despite how relaxed these residents seem, the increased military presence gives it away, with residents stating that it is normal to see armored vehicles going by regularly. On top of that, the number of people joining the army and volunteer militias like the Lithuanian Riflemen has spiked, with everyone eager to be a part of keeping Russia out. According to the residents, there are thousands more requests to join the volunteer militia being made this year, and according to one volunteer, there is a waiting list of 2.5 years. To see how the residents are preparing, let's take a look at Jonas and Vida Sukditis. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, I apologize to that family. Standing inside their underground shelter with their emergency food stock. Because of the history of bombing and the future of war, bomb shelters like this one are being built by many Lithuanian residents. You may be able to explain away this type of preparation as just caution, but what must we make of German troops being deployed to Lithuania? In April of this year, about 24 German soldiers arrived in Lithuania, laying the groundwork for a further 150 to join them later this year. By the end of 2027, the goal is to have 5,000 soldiers in Lithuania. These troops are going to be permanently stationed in Lithuania and become part of Germany's Lithuanian Brigade. The aim is to prepare for the triggering of Article 5 of the NATO alliance. Such a bold move could also work as a deterrent against an army looking to step in. According to German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, the world is completely different from where it was before February of 2022. Both Germany and Lithuania recognize that the national defense is not enough, and alliances will have to be utilized to fight Russia. The fortification plan is the defense element of Lithuania's plan, but this military collaboration is a part of Lithuania's more aggressive strategy against Kaliningrad. We keep talking about the war as one between Lithuania and Russia, but what are the sentiments in Kaliningrad? Although it is a part of Russia, the region has its own identity and relations. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Kaliningrad and Ukraine had a relatively decent relationship. In fact, for a couple of years, there had been talks about Kaliningrad becoming a fourth Baltic state. Although Kaliningrad Kaliningrad is a part of Russia, Europe's attitudes toward it is different. The region is considered a special economic zone, and it has been a zone for a lot of investment. Because of this, it has earned itself the nickname the Baltic Hong Kong, and many foreign investors have helped find urban renewal and reconstruction projects. The region has also become a great tourist spot, with the creation of local history museums, transforming the birthplace of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant into an emerging tourist destination. Turning Kaliningrad into a tourist destination has had the effect of disassociating it from Russia and giving it its own harmless feel. While the rest of Russia does not get to travel around Europe as freely, 82% of Kaliningraders had passports for foreign travel. Things have not always been good between the Kremlin and Kaliningrad, and between 2009 and 2010, there were rampant anti-government protests. To quiet the uprising, Moscow had to dispatch a special envoy, and the heavy military presence that exists in Kaliningrad is actually to be able to control these masses. Kaliningrad does not benefit in any way from the war in Ukraine, and for the most part, it has tried to stay out of the mess that Putin has made. Unfortunately, by virtue of being a part of Russia, it is going to be the grounds of the war between Moscow and Lithuania. Lithuania is not the only state in the Baltics that is preparing for war with Russia. With a fear of turning out just like Ukraine, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia agreed at the beginning of 2024 to set up a common Baltic defense zone on their borders with Russia and Belarus. The defense minister of all three Baltic countries met in January and began to approve plans for the construction of anti-mobility defense installations on their eastern frontiers. The three nations have also agreed to develop missile artillery cooperation and allow them to share their arsenal a lot easier in the case of a war. Estonian Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur focused a lot on the importance of bunkers at the border, stating that it was just as important to prepare to be on the defensive as it was to rally troops up. Estonia is looking to build 600 bunkers along its 183-mile, but 294-kilometer border with Russia, with construction expected to begin as early as 2025. The budget was about $65 million, and each bunker will be able to house 10 soldiers. Estonia and Latvia have also signed a cooperation agreement, in which both nations will be conducting NATO air policing from Latvia's Lietuvade airbase, as Estonia's Amari airbase is currently down due to repairs. The countries have also ramped up their defense spending, with Estonia spending 3.43% of its GDP and Latvia spending 3.15%, the second and fourth highest defense spending totals in NATO on a per-GDP basis. Just like Lithuania, Latvia has a multinational battalion led by Canada that is not stationed permanently like the German one, but that is ready to be deployed as soon as it is needed. An increase in the military budget is always the first sign that a war is on the horizon. Lithuania has set aside a lot of money to bump up its defenses, along with plans for fortification along its border with Kaliningrad. The bridge joining these two areas is also a part of the region being heavily fortified, and the Suwalki Gap is also not being spared. Lithuania will also be relying on its allies and Article 5 of NATO in the case of war. Currently, Putin has his hands full with Ukraine, but if things continue to escalate, the war could be moving down to the Baltics.